Roughly 55,000 men and over 3,500 women served as guards in the Nazi concentration camp system over the course of the war. These were the men and women who watched over the most methodical killing operation in human history, escorting prisoners to gas chambers and standing on watchtowers, while hundreds of thousands starved to death below. And when the war ended in May 1945, the vast majority of them were never punished. A handful were tried and executed, but most simply disappeared into post-war Germany, changed their names, found new jobs, and lived out their lives in silence. A few fled to the other side of the world. This is what happened to them. The concentration camp guard force was run by a branch of the SS known as the SS-Totenkopfverbände, the Death's Head Units. They wore a skull and crossbones insignia on their collar tabs, and they were trained at Dachau under Theodor Eicke, who built the model of organized cruelty that every other camp would follow. Guards were drilled to see prisoners not as human beings, but as enemies of the state. Brutality was not just tolerated, but rewarded. As the war expanded, the camp system grew with it, eventually encompassing more than 1,000 camps and subcamps spread across occupied Europe. The demand for guards far exceeded what the SS could supply from volunteers, so the system began pulling in older reservists, wounded soldiers unfit for frontline duty, ethnic Germans from occupied territories, and even foreign auxiliaries. By the end of the war, the guard force was a patchwork of fanatical SS ideologues, reluctant conscripts, and men who had simply ended up in the wrong uniform. When Allied forces liberated the camps in the spring of 1945, the scenes they encountered were beyond anything they had been prepared for. At Bergen-Belsen, British soldiers found 60,000 prisoners, many of them barely alive, surrounded by 13,000 unburied corpses. At Dachau, American troops discovered railroad cars filled with the bodies of prisoners who had died during transport. At some camps, Allied soldiers were so horrified that they turned their weapons on the guards. At Dachau, American troops shot a number of SS guards on the spot in what became known as the Dachau Liberation Reprisals. It was not sanctioned, but it was also never seriously prosecuted. In the immediate aftermath, the Allies detained hundreds of thousands of SS members. The Nuremberg Tribunal declared the SS a criminal organization, which meant that membership alone was grounds for arrest and investigation. Camp personnel were a particular focus. The Allies conducted a series of major war crimes trials targeting the staff of specific camps. The Belsen trial, held by the British in late 1945, prosecuted 45 members of the Bergen-Belsen and Auschwitz staffs. 11 were sentenced to death, including Camp Commandant Josef Kramer and the notorious female guard Irma Grese. The Dachau trials, run by the Americans, prosecuted staff from Dachau, Buchenwald, Mauthausen, and Flossenburg. Hundreds of defendants were tried, and dozens were sentenced to death. Poland conducted the most prosecutions of any country, trying hundreds of Auschwitz and Stutthof personnel. In the first Stutthof trial alone, 12 of 13 defendants were sentenced to death and publicly hanged. But these trials, dramatic as they were, touched only a fraction of the people responsible. The camp system had employed tens of thousands of guards, administrators, clerks, and support staff. The Allied war crimes programs were overwhelmed by the sheer scale of the task. Witnesses had been murdered, records had been destroyed. Identifying individual responsibility within a machine designed to defuse it was nearly impossible. And as the Cold War took hold in the late 1940s, the Western Allies lost their appetite for prosecution. Resources were redirected, sentences were reduced. By the early 1950s, many convicted war criminals had been released from prison, their sentences commuted under various clemency programs designed to normalize relations with the new West German state. In West Germany, the pursuit of camp guards slowed to a crawl. The legal standard that German courts applied required prosecutors to prove that an individual had personally committed a specific act of murder. Simply serving as a guard at a death camp was not enough. This meant that thousands of men who had stood on the ramps at Auschwitz, who had locked the doors of gas chambers, who had escorted prisoners to their deaths, could claim they were just following orders and walk free if no witness could connect them to a particular killing. The Frankfurt Auschwitz trials from 1963 to 1965 were a significant exception. 22 former Auschwitz personnel were put on trial, and 6 received life sentences. But even then, many former SS men who testified as witnesses were never charged. Meanwhile, thousands of former camp personnel simply resumed civilian life, changing their names, moving to new cities, and becoming factory workers, shop owners, and insurance salesmen. Some returned to government service through Article 131 of the Basic Law, the same provision that allowed former Nazi police officers and teachers back into public employment. Others kept their heads down and were never identified at all. Some went much further. In the chaos of post-war Europe, secret escape routes known as ratlines funneled wanted Nazis out of the continent. With the help of sympathetic Catholic clergy, forged Red Cross passports, and the active support of the Argentine government under Juan Perón, hundreds of former SS officers fled to South America. Franz Stangl, the commandant of the Treblinka extermination camp, escaped to Brazil in 1951 and lived there for 16 years before being tracked down by Nazi hunter Simon Wiesenthal and extradited to West Germany. Adolf Eichmann, the architect of the Holocaust's logistics, was captured by Mossad agents in Buenos Aires in 1960 and brought to trial in Jerusalem. Josef Mengele, the camp doctor who performed horrific medical experiments at Auschwitz, fled to Argentina, then Paraguay, then Brazil, and drowned while swimming in 1979 without ever facing justice. Gustav Wagner, an SS officer at Sobibor known for his extreme cruelty, lived openly in Brazil until his arrest in 1978. The Brazilian Supreme Court refused to extradite him, and he died 2 years later. The legal landscape shifted dramatically in 2011 with the trial of John Demjanjuk, a former guard at the Sobibor extermination camp. A court in Munich convicted Demjanjuk of being an accessory to the murder of more than 28,000 people, not because prosecutors could prove he had personally killed anyone, but simply because he had served as a guard at a facility whose sole purpose was mass murder. This was a landmark. For the first time, German courts accepted that working at a death camp was itself participation in murder. The Demjanjuk precedent opened the door to a new wave of prosecutions targeting the last surviving camp personnel, most of them now in their 90s. In the years that followed, a handful of elderly former guards were brought to trial. Oskar Groening, known as the bookkeeper of Auschwitz, was convicted in 2015 at the age of 94. Reinhold Hanning, a former Auschwitz guard, was convicted in 2016 at 94. Irmgard Furchner, a former secretary at the Stutthof camp, was convicted in 2022 at the age of 97. These trials were largely symbolic. The defendants were too old to serve meaningful prison sentences, but they carried an enormous moral weight. They established, decades too late, that there was no such thing as an innocent bystander inside a death camp. The story of the concentration camp guards is, in many ways, the story of how justice failed and then slowly tried to correct itself. Of the tens of thousands who served, only a small fraction ever faced a courtroom. Many lived full lives, collected pensions, raised families, and died of old age without ever being held accountable. A few were hunted across continents by Nazi hunters and intelligence agencies. A handful were prosecuted in their final years as the legal definition of guilt finally caught up with the reality of what they had done. And for the vast majority, there was simply silence, an entire population of perpetrators who disappeared into the ordinary fabric of post-war life as if nothing had happened at all. If you found this video insightful, please like the video, subscribe, and hit the bell to get more after history. Thanks for watching.